Sorry, I was muted. Okay, can everybody see that well enough?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry I was muted for a minute there and didn't realize it. So, thank you everyone so much for coming to my presentation, my capstone presentation. Wow, I can't believe I'm saying that. Um, 4 things corporate creatives should understand, and I'm just going to jump right into it. So, for some of you who might not know me personally, I know many of you do. My name is Lex, and I am obviously a multidisciplinary major, and my major concentration is design visualization and creative direction. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some things that I have learned over the course of my education, a lot of what makes what I do different from traditional art and design education, and what I think it means to be a corporate creative, which I consider myself. Um, so, a couple questions. Why should I know these things, or why should I care? I have been asking myself these same questions for 15 weeks, and I would say that is almost entirely the gist of my project. Um, and why my interests and courses have made me a better creative, despite many of them not being required. And also, kind of disproving this little bit of falsehood that creative and corporate are often interpreted like oil and water, and were even presented that way to me for the majority of my life thus far, despite the reality being quite the opposite. And there's my headshot. So, my first order of business, or first concept, is actually the importance of semiotic concepts and their flaws, which, thanks to my faculty advisor, I have come to understand much more thoroughly during the process of my project development. And the fact that most individuals are not really aware of the term semiotics in and of itself is kind of a shock to me in my industry, just talking to peers. Um, Despite the fact that, visual communications is comprised of so much more than what meets the eye on first glance, semiotics as a concept nonetheless is so flawed, which is also directly pointed to by this quote that I have down here, that the only things that are really definable have no history, because everybody has their own interpretation visually of any icon, symbol, or index. And I think this is something that's really invaluable to understand as a creative. But like I said, so many of my peers are not even aware of the meaning of the term semiotics. Moving on. Another really enlightening thing that I had the opportunity to learn about in my education, and that I think is really invaluable for other creatives to understand, is the process of design thinking and other approaches. Design thinking actually is not just something I made up, it is a coined term by Mr. Tim Brown, that actually originated in Silicon Valley to prompt maybe more left brain or type A, engineers, business people to think like a designer. And I think many of us sort of discredit this because it might be something we might already practice, um, just through habit, because that is how a lot of us just kind of our brains work and the nature of our field. But I think this understanding of design thinking, which is like I mentioned, a specific process with sort of the steps and um, workflow being developed and shown in this diagram, um, sort of leads to an understanding, as I stated here, as our roles as designers in the workflow and in our team dynamic, and leads us to an exploration that might prompt us to change our process and not just come up with alternate solutions, but alternate approaches to how we achieve our solutions. Medium and media. So I am actually an immersion in advertising and PR, which I thought I'd mention just because I know that particular bit of information isn't necessarily anywhere on the slides. Um, but the relevance of media and media is really the tipping point of success in this day and age of communication, especially with the costs of things nowadays to be printed and to buy media and purchase media, and the many options of different media vehicles, including social media. Not only the media vehicles, but the vehicles for mediums such as color spaces and print methods, which I've also had the great opportunity to learn about. Print methods like flexography and lithography, and how your design is reflected in those print methods and for optimal production and things of that nature. Also, the way color spaces work has been really enlightening to me. We do hear the terms RGB and CMYK and grayscale, but often I've noticed prior to kind of venturing out and seeking this knowledge, myself and my peers didn't really know what that meant. And basically, my just for this slide is this little term I've sort of coined to design for versus for the design. And in order to explain this, I have to give a bit of a example. So to design for is what we're seeing more frequently. We're designing for a specific media or medium with the intention of it being produced a certain way. Versus something we maybe don't see as frequently is to determine a media or medium or reproduction method after the design is produced to best serve the design. So are you designing for the media, or are you selecting a media that best reflects and reproduces serves the design? And last but not least, one of my favorite slides, what it means to be a creative. Now, this is something that I have been asking myself even before I began my college career, and something I asked myself before I even went to school to be a creative, before I even knew what I wanted to do. And I want to begin by citing one of my favorite quotes, which is actually from a book that I had the opportunity to read in my honors English course. It is called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and the quote is, "Because survival is insufficient." And this is actually written on the side of a caravan of Shakespeare performers. And a little bit of a premise of the book is that, kind of like COVID, a plague has happened, except it's wiped out everything. And this is the last sort of little presence of non-necessity this group of travelers have, is performing these creative works. And I think it really speaks to that sometimes we really question our importance as creatives, and it impacts our work. I really believe that it does impact our quality of work and our sort of belief in ourselves and what role we play in the dynamic and process of coming to a solution or solving a problem that we have been tasked with, um, visually. But I also believe that creativity is really to make life more beyond necessity. Um, Creatives are who make an experience, I like to say. I vary about the word visual experience. And I really think that sometimes many of us in the field, even though this is what we do every day, um, we don't think about this. It sometimes goes right over our heads, and I think it's infinitely important to remind ourselves who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. And it really contributes to us doing our best work and to recognize the power of our creativity in organization with the previous concepts I've mentioned, actually, and how powerful organized creativity can truly be in any effective media vehicle or solution or conveying any type of information, whether it's visually or technically. And this is a little bit of a conclusion and sort of an explanation as to what drove me to produce this project. So, I saw a need initially that I have previously briefly mentioned, um, in recognizing in myself and my peers this sort of lack of awareness of particular things that I realized I was learning in my multidisciplinary education, but some of my previous peers in that were just in a design or art or even creative writing course or even music or theater courses or anything of that nature didn't see and didn't understand, yet I really felt they were so invaluable to my own work and my own education. Um, and that kind of brings me to my next bullet, and that, yes, I realize this is what makes me sort of a cut above or gives me an edge in the workplace and gives me an edge for employment. But I realized that I needed to share these things in order to sort of leave my mark on the industry, which I think is sort of my ultimate goal that doesn't necessarily pertain to one particular position. Um, and that is sort of the summary of my own intentions is to make creatives and those who work with creatives um, prompt critical thinking in general of those audiences and really reflect how the value of what I have learned has helped me and how I think it can make a difference in the industry. And that brings me to my question and answer slide.
Lex, we haven't spoken before, I don't know. You said your concentration is advertising and public relations. Is that where you're going? Is that where you're headed career-wise?
So, my immersion is in advertising and public relations. Um, my concentration involves communications and graphic design. So, I've kind of coined myself with the term design visualization and creative direction because that is ultimately what I'd like to do in my career.
When you think about when you graduate, I don't know if you're graduating this semester, but when you graduate, what sort of position are you hoping to go into to begin with?
I would like either a communication associate or uh, maybe junior art or creative directing position. Um, I'm open to both positions in communication and design because I truly enjoy both of those things, and I really think they kind of go hand in hand.
So you've got these four elements in your package here. I'm not quite sure what to call it, but I guess so imagine yourself in such a position, and this is you. This is what you want to express. This is what you think is important. I mean, does it become educational? I mean, how are you going to realize these ideas? I mean, Speak to that a minute.
So I actually came to realize myself that yes, my goal is to produce sort of an educational guide that I have going here, but it almost presents itself like a TED Talk, which I don't think is a bad thing. Um, and I really just want to prompt discussion and critical thinking with others in my field and maybe even others outside the field as to kind of these what these realizations I've come to and these ideas and concepts can be implemented and what thoughts others have about them, which is also really important to me because I really enjoy teamwork and collaboration.
Sure, sure. So that was fascinating. But I would like to open it up to other. I see there are a couple of other faculty. I know Meg is en route now, so she cannot she can't ask a question. But Chip or Jim, do you have any questions? And I think McKinney was there too, although I don't see your picture here. Does anybody else have any questions?
Questions or comments, anything.
So Lexi, what's the most important thing you've learned from your time at RIT or
I
your study of these
honestly
topics?
think that it would either be lifelong learning or constantly continuing my own education to better myself as a creative. Because if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have discovered many of these things. Or sort of seeing my power as a creative and in what I do. Um, and then, kind of as I mentioned, for much of my life, I wasn't even aware of careers like this. And I had very little value and faith in my ability in a career path of such nature. And now I've seen the potential of my own career and of the others I work with and collaborating with others to, produce solutions and make things that really touch other people's uh, or make a mark on other people. I really like that term to make a mark in the industry and just in the public eye and things of that nature.
So when you think back over all the print ads that you've ever seen, or maybe even radio commercials or television commercials, is there one commercial that stands out to you as just the best thing you've ever seen, and why? Why is it so appealing to you?
So that is a very good but difficult question for me to answer because I've seen so many.
But
Um,
you must have a favorite.
yes.
And
So
why is it a favorite? Why did it appeal to you? How's it a
I
paradigm?
grew up looking at a lot of fashion magazines. Um, and I think the first type of ad or visual that really stuck with me were probably the cosmetic ads for Chanel, funny enough. Um, I have always been someone that's very engaged by aesthetic and things of that nature. So, as for stationery, I can think of, I don't know if it's necessarily my favorite, but it was the first thing that really stuck with me. And I think eventually led, even though I had no idea at the time, to me choosing my career path. Um, but as for actual moving ads on the television or social media, one of my favorite campaigns that I actually just did another presentation about was for the brand, or I should say the platform called Masterclass. And they basically have collected a myriad of experts in their fields. And who they chose as sort of their flagship face of their campaign, their first comprehensive campaign, was actually Anna Wintour, who's one of my idols. So that immediately got my attention. And that also actually got some recognition for um, in case studies for one of the best campaigns of that year. And I just never get sick of watching that ad and hearing what she has to say. And it probably speaks to me because of the effect she has on my appeal she has to my ethos. But yeah, those are the two things that really come to mind.
Thank you.
Lex, how did your participation in the Napier experience impact your thinking about this work?
So the Napier experience actually prompted me to officially declare my immersion in advertising and PR and go out and seek more courses in advertising and PR, which I think the courses that I have taken have contributed a lot to, some of the concepts I presented on, especially medium and media, and understanding how that works, outside of just the artistic process or artistic works that I'm involved in. Um, and I think a general understanding of the media and public relation process has definitely impacted my work. It's made me definitely want to possibly be employed by an advertising and public relations agency, which is definitely somewhere I'd be interested in working. And it's really opened my eyes to that whole world, and I just find it really fascinating. And I just was so engaged by what they did there and the environment they produced that it just inspired me to keep learning more and knowing more in hopes to, weasel my way through that door one day.
We're gonna stay on time to the best of our ability. So I'm gonna move over to Anastasia, but Lex, Mary Elena put a note in the chat. I don't know if you've been following the chat, but she captured your creatives create an experience, and I'd written down that phrase too. So I just wanted to make sure that you saw that, because I know you've been focused on answering questions and not necessarily looking at the chat. Anyway, thank you very much. Great presentation. And now,
Thank you so much, everybody that came. Warms my heart.
Anastasia, would you like to share your screen? And we can see it, but I can't hear you.
There we go. Okay.
There you go. Okay. Thank you.
Out of curiosity, can you guys see my mouse? I might want to like point at different things.
I can see your mouse.
Okay. Fantastic. So I did my capstone on a bacteria called Streptococcus mutans. First, a bit of background. So Streptococcus mutans is a bacteria that can build up in your mouth, pharynx, and intestine. This can be of a person of any age starting in infancy. So this bacteria, specifically in the oral cavity, can build up within a biofilm. We more commonly know it as plaque. It can be up to like 100 cells thick. It causes cavities and the breakdown of tooth enamel. It also causes tooth decay over time through the fermentation reaction of carbohydrates like sucrose and fructose and on the teeth. So the adherence process of strep mutans has been shown to be mediated by two different mechanisms. The first one is an interaction between an opportunistic pathogen and a complex layer of salivary glycoproteins, which is bound to the mineral of the teeth. This is mediated.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Sorry, yes.
It's an echo effect which is accompanying your voice. I don't know if it's at your end or.
I think if like everybody mutes themselves, there's no feedback. It might be like from other computers. I'm not entirely sure. That's just been my experience with things. Is that better?
And I still got you're audible, but it's a little bit of a distraction. But carry on.
Okay. Sorry. Anyway, so it's by a complex layer of salivary glycoproteins, which is bound to the matrix of the teeth. This is mediated by this enzyme right over here, which is streptococcal antigen 1,2 or SA12. The second one is due to synthesis of a water-insoluble glucan by glucotransferase, which allows tenacious adhesion and accumulation of other pathogens on the tooth surface, which is done by this protein right over here. Great. So these cartoons describe the orientation of the distinct region of the glycoprotein and the antigen. As it appears on the orientation of the helical regions that anchor to the cell surface, which is kind of like that curly part that you see there, which is an alpha helix. In this case, it's particularly interesting to note that the ligand binding regions on both of these is in the opposite direction. This gives rise to the idea that while the antigen could be thought of as like an extending grabber, the glycoprotein that binds to glucans, which are predominantly on the tooth surface, would serve to bring the Streptococcus mutans closer to the surface, promoting colonization. So the glucan binding proteins, which are on the surface, help attach strep mutans to like a sort of scaffold. They're named for their ability to interact with the glucan matrix, which is known as dextrin. Dextrin is a complex branch glucan, which is basically just a polysaccharide derived from the condensation of glucose. So the GTFs are enzymes that could use starch and sugars to produce various types of glucan polymers. The glucan polymers then create a sort of scaffold which other microbes adhere to and colonize. This is what creates the biofilm. The byproduct of this reaction is a localized acidic environment, which is what causes the cavity and breaks down of the tooth surface. So among the 4 glucan binding proteins discovered, which are A, B, C, and D, only C is a surface anchored protein. This protein contains a signature LPXTG, yes, LPXTG motif, which is processed by a sortiase to anchor the surface protein onto a peptoglycan layer. This is done in many gram-positive bacteria, and several distinct mechanisms of cell wall attachment and display of surface proteins have been described by this. So sortiase, or SRTA, as the abbreviation is a membrane localized cysteine protease transpeptidase. It's kind of long, kind of confusing. Don't worry about it. It's related to the pathogenesis of a gram-positive bacterial infection, which is the main important part of this. So it's hypothesized that glucan binding protein C plays an important role in early biofilm formation, while A and D contribute to latter biofilm formation. So sucrose-dependent adhesions are considered important virulence factors for potential targets of therapeutic interventions. So in the native structure, a metal binding site contains a Ca2+ ion, which is coordinated through oxygen atoms of serine 347, which is a main chain and a side chain. ASN 349, which is a side chain, glucan 360. These are basically just all amino acids that are that have been tagged in this about 500 and some odd amino acid long protein. Anyway, so first dextrose directly binds with the calcium ion in the metal binding site by effectively displacing a previously observed water molecule in the native glucan binding protein C structure. And this is generally in close proximity to other interaction sites. Generally in particular is a loop region. This is where this graph becomes important. So there was a study done where they took this loop region and edited out of the protein. It used, I'm not entirely sure, I'm pretty sure they used CRISPR for this, which is the gene editing tool. But they edited it out of the protein, and what it basically showed was that this loop was very important for the formation of the biofilms. Because without this loop, the biofilms did not form. But then when they returned it back to the protein, and just was wild type, which wild type means unedited. So if the unedited protein, it created biofilm just fine. And this one, so both glucan binding protein and the antigen 1,2 are important for dextrin dependent aggregation, which is basically sticking to the dextrin scaffold. So glucan binding protein C has been previously reported to mediate dextrin dependent aggregation, and deletion of the N-terminal end of this glucan binding protein significantly reduced the bacterial aggregation. Consistently, the loop region deletion mutant of the 1,2 protein exhibited decreased bacterial aggregation, and the similar glucan binding protein C mutation did not affect bacterial aggregation. So when both 1,2 and glucan binding protein C were deleted, the Streptococcus mutant lost its ability to aggregate. And so this is what this graph shows right here. So This data basically just suggests that both surface proteins are important for the dextrin-induced bacterial aggregation. Now, there's a few different serotypes, which is a serologically distinguishable strain of a microorganism of Strep mutans. The most common is being C, E comes in a close second, and then there's also F, A, and K. So the S mutant serotypes are distinguished based on their chemical composition of serotype-specific ramenated glucose polymers, or RGPs. These polymers are made up of a backbone of raminerase and connecting side chains of different glucosidic residues. So the first NCBI nucleotide was utilized to discover a FASTA sequence for each of these serotypes. The FASTA sequence is basically just the string of amino acids that make up the protein. So these were compared to each other visually for differences in length. In actuality, the comparison of using the NCBI nucleotide was kind of unsuccessful to analyze the serotypes, as there's not much literature found on the serotypes, and the GenBank sequence obtained and used may not be correct. They're kind of very hard to find, and it's very difficult to tell that you're using the right one. However, other 4 serotypes were successfully identified in NCBI. So the FASTA sequence obtained from the NCBI for each serotype was entered into a clustral W, specifically a muscle, which is a multiple sequence comparison by long expectation. Very long name. I just call it muscle, much better. So this proves a successful global alignment. The muscle program was chosen as a tool for this project because it works best with non-distantly related sequences, such as different serotypes of the same species, like we have here. So it compares the entire sequence rather than small fragments. With the phylogenetic tree for the multiple sequence alignments generated from said clustral W, the different serotypes could be compared at an evolutionary level. It was found that serotype C and E were most closely related to each other than the other serotypes. This close relatedness is further supported by the information outlined in this figure, where serotype A and C can be seen having numerous matches among the alignments, as well as gaps that line up. So serotypes that have closer connections in this phylogenetic tree are more closely related, while if the distance between them is longer, they're more distantly related evolutionarily. So this is a phylogenetic tree generated from a FASTA sequence derived from the NCBI and entered into a muscle. As illustrated, A and C have a much closer evolutionary relationship than the others. Serotype F is close, followed by E, and then K being most distant. So here is the personal research that I did on the Streptococcus mutans different serotypes. So I personally worked with C, E, and F. This graph shows under anaerobic conditions, which is with oxygen. I use various different sugars, sucrose being your just general table sugar that you add to food normally. Then it goes down the line. We have some different ones like dextrose, xylitol, sorbitol, and isomalt. Most of you will probably be more familiar with agave, Splenda, Sweet and Low, stevia, and equal, which are all table replacement sugars. This graph is of a biofilm assay that I did, which basically, so when biofilms are created, the Streptococcus mutans grows more in whatever it likes to ferment. So this graph shows that it liked to ferment the table replacement sugars much more than it actually liked to ferment sucrose, which is normal table sugar. I also did the same one. This is in microaerophilic conditions, which is low oxygen and a higher CO2 content, which is actually mimicking the conditions in your mouth while you sleep, because when you sleep, you have a microaerophilic environment because you don't really open your mouth when you sleep, so there's no oxygen going in and out, and you create like a lower oxygen environment. Here you can see that it very obviously likes oxygen very much, so it didn't grow as much as it did in the aerobic conditions. Otherwise, showing that this also shows that it liked the table replacement sugars better than it liked the sucrose, which is our normal table sugar that we think of when we say, oh, if you eat that lollipop, it's going to cause cavities. This study was mainly done to show whether or not table replacement sugars are safe enough for diabetic friendly diabetic patients, because they use these sugars in replacement of sucrose in order to control their blood sugar levels. But I wanted to see if the bacteria still fermented said sugars and they were still at risk for cavities. Questions?
Um, so Anastasia, again, I'm getting a lot of echo there. And not being a biochemist, I struggled to follow that, but it's, I liked your phrase kind of long and kind of confusing. That's sort of, that I picked up on. So you must have done this sort of work before, right? I mean, you can't have just done all this fresh from, from.
This was actually all fresh, yeah.
Wow.
So the I have previously worked with Streptococcus mutans with my research professor, Dr. Robert Osgood. However, it was for a completely different project. He just let me have access to the bacteria samples that he had. I came up with the design myself as well. For the sequence alignments, the muscle, and the cluster W, that is basically just sitting down in front of the computer, looking up all of the FASTA sequences and spending like a good several days aligning them. You can do it by hand. However, we have some lovely people who computerize it for us. Bioinformaticians are amazing like that. And then the first part of it, where I explained the active site and the orientation and the other parts of the glucan binding protein and the antigen 1-2, that was pure paper research. So I read so many papers to get that.
Were you working by yourself on the whole project, or did you
Yes.
have a mentor? This was all your, wow.
I was mostly by myself. The research aspect was overseen by Dr. Osgood,
Okay.
but he mostly just said, have at it. You know what you're doing. So.
To go right to the conclusion, and one of your, I think maybe your last slide. So let's say I'm diabetic, which I'm not, but let's say I was, and I'm considering what sort of sugar to use. So can you repeat your conclusion? On the one hand, natural sugars, sucrose, and on the other hand, I don't know,
Right, of course. So as you can see in this graph, I changed the slide back. The height of each bar is basically how much the bacteria grew in that condition. So each of these were 10%. Sorry, each of these were 1% sugar solutions that I grew them in association with like a nutrient broth. So you can see the ones in the back here. So the stevia, equal, sweet and low, and Splenda all have like really tall columns. Whereas in the front, sucrose and dextrose have relatively shorter columns, so it didn't grow as much. Also, you can see that serotype C, which is actually the most common ones, in general grew a lot more than E or F.
Can you flip to the other condition, that one? Yes.
Yeah, so it's much, this graph is less chaotic because there is less oxygen, so it did grow a bit less. So even here you can see sucrose didn't grow as nearly as much as say stevia did all the way in the back there.
Okay, let me switch gears. So would I be right in thinking you're going to be going into biochemistry?
Actually, I would like to go to med school, but I do have a fellowship this summer for biochem research.
Okay, I think you're going to be very successful.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? There are no other biochemists out there, huh?
Actually, I do have a quick question that I thought of.
Yeah, of course.
So I was wondering what prompted your interest and drove you to choose focusing on diabetes, because I know there has been actually for many years shortages and concerns on insulin availability and prices. So I wasn't sure if these possible suggestions or this possible information would be helpful to that situation, or what sort of inspired you to make this analysis?
Of course. So this project originally started off because I was already familiar with the bacteria itself. I had already worked with it before, and I knew I could acquire samples very easily. But even further with that, the reason why I wanted to work with diabetic friendly sugars like the sugar alcohols and the table sugar replacements is I actually have a diabetic friend. And I was just like, hey, what's a project that I could do that could impact somebody that I know? And I came up with this, which is kind of relatively easy. I just combined my knowledge of a bacteria that I've previously worked with and was comfortable with what could I possibly do with this to impact somebody's life.
I think that's really great, and it gives me a little bit more insight into your project.
If there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, Anastasia. That was it was difficult to follow, but it sounded like it was a great project, and I'm looking forward to the symposium. And I will spend some time at your poster trying to understand it a little bit more than I do right now. But
Thank you.
We will now move on to Erica. If you would like to share your screen, Erica.
Hi guys, give me 1 second. All right, can everybody see that okay? Awesome.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. Hi, if you don't know me, my name is Erica Wentworth. I work at Bob Johnson. That's kind of why I wanted to do this project in a way of helping my company that I work for. The biggest reason that prompt me to do this project, over the summer, I had a customer, previous manager call me and say, hey, we have some deaf customers. Would you mind coming down to help us out? I am fluent in American Sign Language. So I said, sure, why not? There was a half an hour left in the day. I asked my manager if that was okay if I ran down to the other store, and he had said, what are you going to get done in a half an hour? The customers put a deposit down on their vehicle and picked it up later that week. So it kind of prompted me to go, a lot can be done in a half an hour if they just have the right tools. So that's where I'm at now. So my project's on deaf inclusion at a car dealership, mainly Bob Johnson. I went around, I asked 100 people if they've worked with deaf customers before. 82 people told me they had, about 18 people told me they didn't. So I stuck with, if they told me no, I said, thank you for your time, and moved on to the person that said yes, while asking them the rest of these questions. My first question was, are you hesitant to help a deaf customer due to the communication barrier? I was actually kind of surprised to see that 16% had told me that they were hesitant. I actually thought that number would be a little bit higher. I've noticed people have told me yes, or they would say no and then say, or do you want the truth? And then I would switch it on them and say, well, yeah, I do want the truth. And the answer was yes. I myself am a little hesitant, even though I know sign language. Changing from being a hearing person and going from a hearing world to just not using my voice and only signing in front of a deaf person it's a challenge. I have a hard time switching my voice back on right afterwards. And to be fair, this is my first presentation I've done speaking in a very long time. So it's kind of weird for me to not be signing right now. I also asked managers if they believe that their employees know how to properly work with deaf customers. I wasn't too surprised with this. I kind of expected a lot of people to say yes. It's not, as long as you are treating them like a person, that's all that mattered to me. So that no, I can understand back and forth as to why people said yes or no. And then I wanted to know if the management believed if their employees were more hesitant to work with deaf customers. I liked this because it kind of gave a little bit more of where I was thinking that the yes and no answers for the employees were going to be, just because it is difficult. You know, maybe they don't have the tools, or they've never worked with one before, so they don't understand the next step in something. So it was kind of nice to see that breakdown. The methods of communication used. So this was one of my big questions that I wanted to know. Actually, only 2 of us know ASL. The other lady that knows ASL, her brother is deaf, so she's been fluent pretty much her whole life, where I started learning 5 years ago. The people who knew some ASL, that was more like them knowing how to say thank you and like hello and just those simple yes, no signs just to kind of help a little bit. But at least they were trying, and I know that when a deaf person is present, that really does mean something to them. The interpreter, I wasn't too surprised that was kind of on the lower side, just because that's something where they have to bring an interpreter in. I know we don't have any interpreters. A lot of people who said that they have used an interpreter, they've called me, even though I'm not an interpreter. I've just been there to help. So they kind of considered that. TTY, that's more for those customers who call in. That texting and writing, I expected it to be that high. That's pretty much the main thing. They come up with their phone and they have everything written out with what they're looking for, their name, all that stuff. Or they're writing back and forth on a pen and paper. Writing back and forth on a pen and paper, that's going to take you all day long. So it was something where my whole point of this project was to try to find something a little bit different. And that other really bothered me. So that's why I put it as other. A lot of people were saying lip reading. It's not always the best skill to use. That's not something they like. If they want to use lip reading, because that's a method that they've used their whole life, absolutely, go for it. But to me, it's just not, I don't know, it's not very great. Different departments that I asked. So there were only a few cashiers that were available to ask parts. Obviously doesn't have as many employees as service and sales. And then I only asked a certain amount of managers. I asked our owner and one of our VPs, and the owner's answers himself, that was actually a little shocking to me, which I'll get into in a little bit. The time frame working for Bob Johnson. So I don't know if everybody here is from the Rochester area. So I work where Dorschel used to be. So we're like Bob Johnson Imports now. So that I asked that side of Bob Johnson. I didn't go around asking, over in Greece or anything like that. I just kind of asked the Dorschel group. We had obviously less than 1 year all the way to 20 plus years. The highest person that I actually spoke to was 38 years that he had worked at the company, which shocked me beyond belief. That's older than myself. A lot of people have worked there older than I am myself, but it was kind of interesting to see. So asking the owner, biggest question was I wanted to know, are they doing something to help? He had said to me that they were going to be getting these kiosks that were going to go in all these sales floors. And I was super excited about it. So I went to go see one of the areas that had, they had the kiosk. I wanted to see what they were. But the short answer here is no. They're really not doing much to help with the deaf community. Those sales kiosks do translate 189 languages, but it's just Google Translate, which when I went to Mazda is where they currently have one of those kiosks. The manager that showed me the kiosk, when I said, oh, well, this isn't what I was looking for, I was hoping it would help with a deaf person. He said, well, can't they read? It infuriated me and made me push this much more to do this project and hope that I could find something that would be some type of tool. Which is exactly what I did find. So I found this VRI, which is an on-demand interpreter. The company is called Boost Lingo, is who I went through. I met with somebody over there. They walked me through how an interpreter works, how you call them. They pop right up. It starts off at $175 a month for 120 minutes a month. If you go over that 120 minutes, it's $1.48 a minute afterwards, or it's $1.90 a minute on weekends, but they are 24/7, which I thought was really interesting. There was other languages as well, so it wouldn't just have to be ASL. There was Arabic and Spanish and Mandarin, all these different things, which I just thought was really interesting. The price goes up from 175. They didn't really tell me exactly how high it could go, but it did. I think the highest amount of minutes you can buy is 750 minutes. So obviously, if you do the math, that is a little steep, but I look at it like this. If if work decides to publicize on the commercial that they now have a VRI with an on-demand interpreter, you might get that deaf population coming in. One of my biggest questions to Boost Lingo was, is there dealerships using your program to help with their customers? And he told me there wasn't a single one in the United States. The only manufacturer of a dealership that uses them is Toyota. And that was for their manufacturing meetings because they have deaf employees that work for them. So that was kind of a shock to me. Bob Johnson is huge. I can see that they could potentially make it a bigger thing where they have, this VRI publicized and more deaf individuals would be able to come in and our sales for them would skyrocket. I actually met with my professor for ASL. I asked her where she goes for servicing her vehicle and how she communicates with the hearing person. She had mentioned that there was one person at the dealership she goes to that does know some signs, so it makes it a little bit easier. And otherwise it's writing back and forth. And so I just wanted to know, if you did something like this, would it make you more comfortable? And she said, absolutely. And, so I look at it, okay, we have one deaf person find out, oh my gosh, they have this system. They tell their friends, they come in, and now we're booming with business. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I would like to know if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
That was a great project. So congratulations on finding 100 respondents, because most of students who do a survey don't reach 100 respondents. So the more respondents you get, obviously, the better your data is. The Boost Lingo, so I think you said it was $175 for 2 hours. Was it 100? Yeah. Okay. So I guess I was surprised, one of your earlier graphs, at how many of the salespeople, I assume we're mostly talking about salespeople, actually had some interaction with deaf customers.
Yeah.
I guess the population of deaf people in the Rochester area is pretty high. So, but it looked like almost all the salespeople at Bob Johnson have actually interacted with a deaf person. So I don't know what the frequency of that is, but
I myself have worked with about 10. I've been there for 1.5 years. They haven't called me every time. Obviously, there's that sales lady that does know sign language herself. My mom actually is a cashier over there, and she's encountered probably more than 10 since being a cashier for a few months. She just kind of nodded to me and said she even had one today. So, we definitely do get a lot in. My boyfriend works in parts over there. He's had deaf customers come up, and he said it's always slightly frustrating when it's all written out on their phone. And he's like, sometimes it's a life story where it's like, hello, my name is this, I became deaf at this age. And it's like, okay, that's not what we need. We just need to know what you're looking for. So that kind of prompted me to do this project as well. I saw in the chat, somebody said, will you share your findings with the company? I absolutely want to. I did speak with my manager about it as soon as I left work early to meet with the people for Boost Lingo. And I went back to work the following day and I told my boss all about it, all excited. And he's like, they won't do that. It's too expensive. And I'm like, it's $175 at the minimum, and you're going to be booming in sales later on. Why wouldn't you? And, so I've had mixed feelings on people telling me don't even bother, with other people saying, why aren't they doing this already? And we'll see.
So I agree with you. It doesn't seem like it's that expensive for what you would be getting, because presumably, word of mouth travels very rapidly in the deaf community. And
for sure.
But for 2 hours.
Word of sign. No, sorry.
2 hours for $175 seems pretty. So a deaf person, give me the picture here. The deaf person comes through the door, is clearly interested in buying a car. So then the sales manager or whoever calls up Boost Lingo and it's immediately available. Is that?
Yep. So most of us carry around tablets, iPads, or we have computers with a camera on it. So there would be an app or the website where they could just click on it, and then there's literally like a phone button that they just call, and within 10 to 15 seconds, an interpreter pops right up. So it's pretty much on demand. And then within 2 minutes after the phone call, after you hang up, you can try to get back that same interpreter if you come up with more questions.
I see. So maybe you need to solicit some support from your deaf customers. Maybe if they said to your sales manager, you know, there's this technology here, why don't you have it? And so it wouldn't just be you that was promoting the idea.
Right. That's why I asked my professor, because, you know, yes, I'm hearing and I don't have any deaf family. I learned ASL just strictly because I wanted to learn the language. I ended up falling in love with it and it became a huge passion of mine. And so I just decided, hey, why don't I do a project on something like this? I wanted to kind of expand this even more into almost like an independent study to see if like Western and Garber and the different dealerships in the Rochester area, if they even have a program that they use. But I don't think there is. I've asked some people who work for the companies and they've told me that they've never heard of it. You know, even our VP, when I asked him, is there something that we use already? He told me no. So it kind of broke my heart a little bit.
I suspect that if one company like Bob Johnson started to do this, the others would follow in pretty quick order. So anyway, does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I guess at the other end of it, does New York State provide any protections for deaf consumers? I would think that anybody, for instance, that didn't speak English and went to sign a contract in English, act would be able to invalidate it. If a deaf consumer says, I won't sign this sales contract without the presence of an interpreter, do they have to be provided with one?
So how it's worked, because I've gone over contracts with deaf customers in the past, and I've asked my manager, because so we have some Spanish speaking employees who, when there's somebody coming from, you know, who speaks Spanish, we grab them really quick to help us. We're not allowed if it's Spanish, the paperwork's in English, they have to actually bring their own interpreter. We're not allowed to provide that to them. With ASL though, because it's English and because they can read English, we can still present it in sign language as long as they're understanding that they have the ability to read that. Whereas somebody who speaks Spanish, if they speak Spanish, they most likely don't read English as well. So they have to provide their own interpreter or translator.
So wait a minute. So I think that's a great question. So if I'm Spanish and I want to buy a car and I don't feel confident in reading an English contract, then the dealership it tells me that I have to go and find a translator?
Yep.
Even if that means that they're going to lose my custom?
I believe so. It's very strange. It's just in case, it's kind of protecting us legally. It's in case, basically, if the gentleman who speaks Spanish decides to tell them something different, and then they go home and show the contract to somebody, and then they say, they told me this, they can't come back at us and say, well, you told me this, even, you know, because I can't read English, you took advantage of me. And like, it could be a big, you know, lawsuit type thing. So that's why they require you to bring your own.
Interesting.
Yep.
Any other questions? Chip.
Erica, I loved your project.
Thank you.
It just is so interesting in so many ways. I mean, my immediate response is not to go with that technological solution, but say that Bob Johnson should just hire an interpreter, or they should hire someone who's studying ASL. And even if they're not a full-time employee, if they're working every Saturday. It also strikes me that this would be a great way for them to market themselves, that they are ASL friendly, that they have ASL interpreters either on staff or on call. And given the numbers of people in the Monroe County and the upstate area, I mean, it's huge. I would think it would really make a tremendous difference, and it would be paid for so fast. Not only, I think, people who are deaf, but people like myself who hear would feel a certain desire to go shop and buy a car there, then because I would think they're thinking of our fellow citizens in that way. My wife has often joked and said, if she walks into a car dealership and she sees nothing but salesmen and not a single lady on the floor, she doesn't want to buy a car there.
Yeah,
She
I
feels
struggle with that every
incredible
day.
difference between the dynamic of buying a car from a woman
Yep.
versus a man.
I work at Mini of Rochester, so where I am, we sell Mini Coopers.
Yep.
I'm at the front desk. I'm not a salesperson. We have 2 salesmen and we have a sales manager who's a gentleman. Our entire service department is men. The gentleman who does paperwork is a man. Literally I'm the only woman in that building. And I have customers left and right come in and say, I only want to buy a car from you. I feel like you're not going to lie to me. And I tell them that all the time. They're like, well, quit school and come in, work for us and do this full time. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for that quite yet, but
Yep.
I'm like, we'll see in the future, but I keep telling them Minnie needs a woman.
Absolutely. And she would clean up. She would sell those men so fast. I mean, the other thought that comes to my mind is my wife is a physician here in town, and she had a colleague that was fairly fluent in American Sign Language. Unfortunately, that colleague has now retired and, is enjoying her retirement, playing golf and, not practicing. But they've yet to best of my knowledge, find anyone to step into her shoes that has some fluency in American Sign Language.
Well, tell her about.
And I know they used to
They have a medical
advertise that
side
even
too.
on their website, and
Yeah.
it was known in the deaf community that there was at least one physician on the staff that was fluent in American Sign Language. And it does make a huge difference.
Really does. I tried getting on my business cards that I knew ASL,
Yep.
and the marketing department wouldn't even let me do that, which I was slightly
They're
frustrated with.
they're crazy.
Yeah.
You're right. They're wrong.
Yeah, because I thought, I could go to deaf events and just start passing them out. And, yeah, it's soliciting in a way, but I'm like, hey, if they just know that one person is there to help, that's all that matters. And I honestly thought that going through and asking, 100 people, what are the chances that I'm going to find, I thought there was maybe at least 5 of us. And I was thinking, that new ASL, and to find out that it was myself and one other person just slightly was upsetting,
Right.
Okay, well, we're past the hour. We're at 3:07. Erica, I think you're getting this off the ground may seem a little slow to begin with, but I think you're onto a winner. So I hope that you continue to push the idea. I think
Awesome.
there's an obvious demand, and I think it will, it'll bring in lots of dollars for the company that accepts the idea.
I hope so.
And
Thank you so much.
And you also will then be the beneficiary, hopefully, because they will.
I hope so. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for all 3 of you. Excellent presentations. We look forward to seeing you again on the 25th, which is exactly 11 days away from today. Please make sure that you get your designs for your posters to Meg so that she can do her magic and change them into a real poster. And we will see you again on the 25th. And thanks also to the audience and your questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.